For 20 years, she built an empire on two words: be kind. It was on the merchandise, in the sign-offs, stitched into the DNA of the most watched daytime show in history. Then, in a single summer, those two words became the weapon used to dismantle everything she had built. Behind the dancing, behind 63 Emmy Awards, behind the smile that reached millions every morning, there was a story the cameras never followed, a girl who learned to make people laugh, not because life was funny, but because the pain was too heavy to carry. What does it cost to tell the truth in front of 44 million people? What happens when the industry you trusted decides it no longer has a place for you? Not once, but twice? Before we answer that, we need to go back to Louisiana, to where a 13-year-old girl's world quietly split in two, and where the armor she built to survive it would one day make her famous. Ellen Lee DeGeneres was born on January 26, 1958 in Metairie, Louisiana, a suburb that smelled of magnolia trees and quiet conformity, where ambition was considered impolite and standing out was its own kind of sin. From the outside, her early life resembled a postcard of ordinary Southern childhood. But beneath that surface lay fractures that would quietly shape everything she would one day become. Her parents, Betty and Elliot DeGeneres, built a home filled with laughter, at first. Her mother, a warm but fragile woman, sang around the house and filled rooms with lightness. Her father, an insurance agent with a steady hand and measured words, provided stability. But stability, as Ellen would later learn, is always more fragile than it appears. When she was 13 years old, her parents divorced. And with that quiet, devastating rupture, the foundation she had known her entire life simply disappeared. The divorce did not just end a marriage, it ended a version of Ellen, the girl who had learned to make people laugh, to dissolve tension with a perfectly timed joke, to soften pain with a smile, now carried something heavier beneath the performance. Humor, she discovered, was not just a gift, it was armor. Her mother remarried, and the years that followed were difficult in ways Ellen has only spoken about in careful, measured fragments. There were wounds she carried in silence, experiences that pressed into the softest parts of her and left marks that comedy could cover but never fully erase. She would not speak of those years directly for a long time. When she finally did, it was not with bitterness, but with the quiet exhaustion of someone who had carried a weight for too long before setting it down. By 17, Ellen had left home. Not triumphantly, not with a suitcase full of dreams and a ticket to somewhere glamorous, but out of necessity. The way young people leave when staying costs too much. She landed in New Orleans, a city loud enough to drown the silence inside her. She waited tables in a restaurant that smelled of fried fish and cigarette smoke. She shucked oysters. She sold vacuum cleaners door to door, watching strangers' faces for signs of interest. And learning without realizing it, the first lesson of performance. Read the room before you speak. She painted houses. She clerked in a law firm where the fluorescent lights hummed a kind of misery she recognized instantly. Each job was its own small defeat, its own quiet reminder that the life she was living did not yet match the life she felt stirring inside her. She was funny. Everyone around her said so. But funny in Louisiana, in a law office, in a seafood restaurant meant nothing. Funny was just something people said before they moved on. Then one night, almost by accident, she stepped onto a small stage at a local coffee house and spoke into a microphone. No grand plan, no polished material, just a young woman with a sharp eye, a quicker tongue, and a lifetime of pain she had learned to translate into punchlines. The audience laughed, and in that laughter, warm, immediate, undeniable, Ellen felt something she had not felt in years. Seen. She was not performing comedy. She was surviving through it. Each joke a quiet negotiation with the wounds she carried. each audience a room full of people who, for a few minutes, made her feel like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She began performing wherever she could: bars, clubs, festivals, anywhere that would have her. She drove hours for 5-minute sets. She slept in her car between shows. She refined her voice not in a classroom or a training program, but in the unforgiving laboratory of live audiences who either laughed or didn't. By her mid-20s, the girl nobody had seen was beginning, slowly and stubbornly, to make herself visible. But the road from Louisiana coffee houses to the national stage was longer and lonelier than even she imagined. And the price of that visibility, when it finally arrived, would cost more than she ever expected to pay. The American comedy circuit in the early 1980s was not built for women. It was a world of smoky backrooms, dollar bills slid under dressing room doors, and audiences conditioned to expect men behind microphones. Women who dared to stand on those stages were either novelties or punchlines themselves. Tolerated, occasionally applauded, rarely taken seriously. Ellen DeGeneres walked into that world anyway. She had been named the funniest person in America by Showtime in 1982. A contest, yes, but a signal nonetheless. A flare fired into a dark sky. The recognition did not open doors immediately, but it told her something important. The instinct she had been trusting in those sweaty coffee houses and half-empty bars was not delusion. It was direction. She began to move with more purpose, refining her material, sharpening her timing, learning the invisible architecture of what makes a stranger trust you enough to laugh. Her style was unlike anything dominating stages at the time. Where others leaned into aggression or shock, Ellen leaned into observation. Gentle, precise, almost philosophical. She noticed the quiet absurdity of ordinary life and held it up to the light with a kind of bemused wonder that felt entirely her own. No cruelty, no edge for the sake of edge. Just an honest, disarming voice that made audiences feel she was talking directly to them, confiding in them, inviting them into her particular way of seeing the world. Then came the night that changed everything. In 1986, Ellen DeGeneres sat on the couch on The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, and performed her stand-up routine live, uninterrupted, to a national television audience of millions. For any comedian, that couch was a coronation. For a woman in that era, it was almost unheard of. Carson watched her perform a bit called Phone Call to God, a whimsical, warm monologue about a flea speaking to its creator. And when she finished, he did something he almost never did. He pointed at her. He beckoned her over to the couch. The gesture was small. The meaning was seismic. In the language of late-night television, Carson's invitation was a declaration. This one matters. The phone calls started the next morning. Managers, agents, producers, people who had never returned messages suddenly had her number memorized. Hollywood, which operates almost entirely on the currency of momentum, recognized that Ellen DeGeneres had just acquired an enormous amount of it overnight. By the early 1990s, she was a fixture on television. Guest spots, specials, the kind of steady accumulation of presence that builds a career into something durable. And then came These Friends of Mine, which was quickly renamed simply Ellen. A sitcom built entirely around her voice, her timing, and her particular warmth. The show debuted in 1994 and found its audience with ease. Ellen Morgan, the character she played, was funny, relatable, slightly scattered, and deeply likable. America invited her into their living rooms every week and felt better for it. The show ran. The ratings held. Ellen DeGeneres was, by every visible measure, exactly where she had spent the last 15 years trying to arrive. National fame. And a series with her name on it. The approval of audiences from Louisiana to Los Angeles. But beneath the sitcom's warm lighting and easy laughter, something enormous was building pressure. A truth she had been carrying for her entire adult life. One that the comedy had helped her survive, that the performance had helped her contain, was demanding to be spoken. And the world she had so carefully built was about to be tested in a way no audience preparation could ever have readied her for. The girl who had learned to make people laugh so they wouldn't ask too many questions was about to answer the biggest one of all. On April 30th, 1997, 44 million Americans tuned in to watch a sitcom character say 3 words. What they witnessed instead was a woman, not a character, but a real, breathing, terrified human being, step off the edge of everything she had built and trust that something would catch her. The episode was called the Puppy Episode internally, a code name designed to keep the secret contained until broadcast. In it, Ellen Morgan, the character Ellen DeGeneres had played for 3 seasons, walked up to an airport microphone and accidentally announced to a terminal full of strangers that she was gay. The laugh track played. The studio audience erupted, but the moment landed differently than any comedy beat the show had ever attempted, because everyone watching understood, yet with a clarity that needed no explanation, that the woman speaking was not acting. Ellen DeGeneres had come out, simultaneously as herself and as her character. On national television in 1997, the audacity of it, the sheer trembling courage required to do what she did, is difficult to overstate in hindsight, and nearly impossible to fully comprehend from the distance of the present. This was not a world that received that kind of announcement warmly. This was a world in which that announcement carried consequences as real and as heavy as anything a person could choose to carry. The response was immediate, and it came from every direction at once. Oprah Winfrey, who guest starred in the episode, called it historic. President Clinton praised it. Letters poured into the network, thousands of them, from people who had never in their lives seen themselves reflected on a television screen, who wept at their sets because finally, someone had said it out loud. Gay men and women across the country described the moment as a before and after in their own lives. The night the world on television looked for the first time a little like the world they actually lived in. But for every letter of gratitude, there was a withdrawal of support. Advertisers began quietly pulling their commercials from the show. The network, sensing the gathering storm, grew cautious. JCPenney pulled out. Chrysler pulled out. The murmur of corporate nervousness became a roar. And then the ratings, which had spiked magnificently for the coming out episode itself, began to fall. The audience that had celebrated the announcement did not necessarily follow Ellen Morgan through the episodes that came after, in which her character now lived openly as a gay woman. The novelty to some had been the confession. The reality, it turned out, was a harder sell. By 1998, Ellen was canceled. The official language was ratings. The truth was more complicated and far less comfortable. Ellen DeGeneres had done something genuine and historic, and the industry had applauded her briefly before returning to business as usual, which did not, at that moment in history, include a leading gay woman at the center of a primetime network comedy. She was thanked for her courage and shown the door. The professional collapse was brutal enough, but what followed in her private life was in many ways worse. The relationship she had been in at the time of the coming out, actress Anne Heche, ended in 2000 after a turbulent 2 years that played out almost entirely in public, dissected by tabloids that treated her personal life as entertainment content. The breakup was not quiet. Nothing in Ellen's life was quiet anymore. She later described those years with the measured restraint of someone who has processed enormous pain and chosen not to perform it for others. She said she could not get work, that her phone stopped ringing, that the Hollywood that had once celebrated her suddenly could not find a place for her. For 3 years, 3 long, quietly devastating years, Ellen DeGeneres was, by the industry's reckoning, finished. The girl who had driven hours for 5-minute sets, who had slept in her car between shows, who had built every brick of her career with her own hands in rooms that didn't expect her. That girl had not disappeared, but she had been buried under the weight of a decision that was right and honest and hers, and that the world had not been ready to absorb without cost. She was 39 years old and starting over. Again, there is a particular kind of silence that follows public collapse. It is not the silence of rest or reflection. It is the silence of a phone that no longer rings, of meetings that no longer get scheduled, of a name that was once spoken in every room and is now spoken in none. Ellen DeGeneres lived inside that silence for 3 years, and she did so without the comfort of knowing it would ever end. She took the jobs that were available, which were few. She performed stand-up again, returning to the stages that had first given her a voice. The intimate rooms where the relationship between performer and audience is immediate and unfiltered. It was humbling in the specific way that only a return to the beginning can be humbling when you have already stood at the top and been asked to leave. But the audiences still laughed. The instinct was still there. The voice had not abandoned her even when the industry had. And then came a fish. In 2003, Pixar released Finding Nemo, an animated film about a father searching the ocean for his missing son. Ellen DeGeneres voiced Dory, a blue tang fish with short-term memory loss, boundless optimism, and an inability to be discouraged by circumstances that would defeat anyone with a longer memory. The character was, in the most uncanny way, a reflection of something essential in Ellen herself. The refusal to stop swimming, the insistence on forward motion even without a clear destination. The particular courage of someone who simply keeps going because stopping is not a language she has ever learned. Finding Nemo became one of the highest-grossing animated films in history. Dory became one of its most beloved characters. And Ellen DeGeneres, the woman Hollywood had quietly decided was finished, became overnight one of the most recognizable voices in the world. The irony was almost too precise to be accidental. The industry that had closed its doors had left a window open, and through it had come something no executive had planned or predicted. The momentum from Finding Nemo arrived at exactly the right moment. Later that same year, in September 2003, The Ellen DeGeneres Show premiered on daytime television. The premise was simple. A talk show hosted by Ellen, built around conversation, comedy, and the dancing that would become its most iconic signature. No sharp edges, no confrontation. The aesthetic was warmth, generosity, and the particular joy of a woman who had survived enough to understand that laughter is not trivial. It is necessary. The show found its audience almost immediately, and then it expanded. And then it became something that had no real precedent in the history of daytime television. A cultural institution that ran for 19 consecutive seasons, won 63 Daytime Emmy Awards, and made Ellen DeGeneres not merely a television host, but a daily presence in the lives of millions of Americans. People who watched her every morning the way earlier generations had watched the news. She was, for nearly 2 decades, the most trusted face on daytime screens. The formula was deceptively simple. Ellen was funny without being cruel. She was generous in ways that felt unperformed. The segments where she surprised struggling families with life-changing gifts, where she handed checks to people whose stories had moved her, where she brought ordinary people onto a stage and treated them as if they were the most important guests she had ever hosted. The audience did not just watch the show, they believed in it. They believed in her. The cultural impact accumulated with the quiet consistency of compound interest. When she danced at the top of each episode, sometimes with guests, sometimes alone, always with the uninhibited joy of someone who has earned the right to take up space, it was not a gimmick, it was a statement. This is what survival looks like. This is what returning from the edge of erasure looks like. This is a woman who was told she was finished, dancing on the set of her own show, watched by millions every single day. By the mid-2000s, Ellen DeGeneres had not merely recovered. She had transcended the version of herself that had existed before the collapse. The coming out, the cancellation, the silence, all of it had become not a wound in her biography, but the very source of her authority. She had paid a price the industry had not asked her to pay. She had paid it anyway, and the audience, which always knows the difference between performance and truth, responded with a loyalty that sustained her for nearly 20 years. She was, as the press eventually acknowledged with something approaching awe, the greatest comeback in the history of American daytime television. But beneath the dancing and the giveaways and the 63 Emmys, the same woman who had learned to use humor as armor in a Louisiana coffee house was still standing behind the lights. And armor, no matter how well crafted, always has seams. It began, as so many reckonings do in the modern age, with a story that was never supposed to become public. In the summer of 2020, while the world was locked inside its own homes and the machinery of television had ground to an uncertain halt, former employees of the Ellen DeGeneres show began to speak. Not loudly at first, not with press conferences or prepared statements, but in the way that truth tends to move when it has been contained too long. In fragments, in whispers passed between people who had shared the same experience and assumed, until that moment, that they had shared it alone. BuzzFeed News published an investigation in July 2020 that collected the testimonies of dozens of former employees. What they described bore no resemblance to the show the world had been watching for 17 years. Behind the dancing and the giveaways and the warm studio light that bathed every segment in the visual language of generosity, they described a workplace defined by fear. A culture of silence enforced not by policy but by the kind of ambient dread that settles into an organization when people understand, without being told directly, that speaking up carries consequences. Former staff described racial discrimination. They described senior producers making comments that had no place in any professional environment. They described people being punished for taking medical leave, for attending family funerals, for doing the ordinary human things that employment law exists to protect. They described being told, I can language both explicit and implied, that their discomfort was irrelevant, that the show and the brand and the image of the woman at the center of it came before everything else. The phrase that attached itself to the coverage and refused to let go was one that Ellen herself had made the foundation of her public identity. Be kind. It appeared on merchandise, on social media graphics, in the sign-off of nearly every episode. It had become, over nearly 2 decades of repetition, inseparable from her name. And now it was being used by her former employees as the precise measure of the distance between the public performance and the private reality. The story spread with a speed that left no room for quiet management. More publications followed, more testimonies emerged, and 3 senior producers were eventually terminated. The network and the show's production company announcing the decision, with the careful language of accountability, while stopping well short of accepting responsibility for how the culture had been allowed to develop. Ellen herself, on a call with her staff, acknowledged that things had happened on her show that she had not known about and could not excuse. Then, in September 2020, she addressed her audience directly at the start of the show's 18th season. She stood on her stage, the stage she had built, the stage she had danced on for nearly 2 decades, and she said she had learned that she was responsible for what happened on her show, whether she knew about it or not. She said she was committed to doing better, and she said it with the composure of someone who had rehearsed the words carefully and understood that no version of them would be sufficient for everyone listening. The audience in the studio applauded. The audience outside the studio was less unified. Because the crisis was not only about the workplace allegations. Running parallel to the BuzzFeed investigation were other stories, smaller in scale but significant in accumulation. Accounts from celebrities and guests who described interactions with Ellen that contradicted the warmth she projected on camera. A narrative began to solidify in the public mind, assembled from individual pieces that might each have been dismissed in isolation. But together, they formed a portrait that was difficult to argue with. The kindness, the story went, had been a brand. On the person behind it had been something more complicated. For Ellen, the specific cruelty of the moment was its inversion. She had spent 23 years building a public identity rooted in a single idea: that she was the person who treated everyone well, who saw the person behind the celebrity, who made ordinary people feel extraordinary. Now that identity was the very instrument being used against her. Every accusation was amplified by the contrast it created with the brand. Every testimony landed harder because of the gap it illuminated between the woman on the stage and the institution she had built around herself. She finished the 18th season. She finished the 19th. And then, in May 2021, she announced that season 19 would be the last. The official framing was evolution, that the show had run its natural course, that she was ready for whatever came next. Those closest to her described something less tidy. The joy, they said, had gone out of it. The thing that had sustained her through nearly 2 decades of daily production, the genuine pleasure of the connection with the audience, had been contaminated by the weight of what 2020 had deposited on the show's foundation. The final episode aired in May 2022. The dancing continued until the last day. But the room felt different, and Ellen DeGeneres, who had survived cancellation once before by trusting that her voice still mattered, was now facing a far more complicated question. It was not whether the industry would take her back. It was whether the audience would. The last time Ellen DeGeneres walked off her own stage, there were no cameras following her into the parking lot. No documentary crew capturing the moment. No carefully staged goodbye that extended the brand into its next chapter. She simply left, and the silence that followed was, in its own way, the loudest thing she had experienced since 1998. For a woman who had spent 19 years filling the same hours of the same days with the same disciplined machinery of production, the pre-show meetings, the segment rundowns, the guest preparations, the dancing that opened every episode like a daily declaration of survival, the absence of that structure was disorienting in ways that went beyond the professional. The show had not merely been her career, it had been her architecture, the frame around which she had organized her identity for nearly 2 decades. Without it, the question of who she was outside of it became not philosophical but immediate. She and her wife, Portia de Rossi, had married in August 2008. In the brief window between the California Supreme Court's legalization of same-sex marriage and the passage of Proposition 8, which would temporarily close that window again. The wedding had been quiet and private, a deliberate contrast to the public nature of everything else in Ellen's life at the time. Portia, an actress who had built her own quietly distinguished career across decades of work, had been a stabilizing presence through the turbulence of the show's final years. Those who knew them described a partnership of genuine depth. 2 people who had each navigated the specific pressures of public life in ways that gave them an uncommon understanding of what the other carried. After the show ended, they retreated. Not dramatically, not with any announcement of withdrawal, but with the quiet decisiveness of people who have decided that a different kind of life is available to them and have chosen to pursue it. They settled in Montecito, the coastal California enclave that has become, in recent years, a sanctuary for those whose relationship with fame has grown complicated. Where the Pacific light is generous and the distance from Los Angeles is sufficient to make the industry feel like someone else's concern, Ellen had always been a collector of homes, buying, renovating, and selling properties with the same instinct for structure and detail that she brought to her television work. In Montecito, she found something different from an investment. She found a place where the pace of life matched the pace she needed. Morning walks, gardens, the kind of unhurried domestic rhythm that 19 years of daily television production had made impossible. But withdrawal for someone of Ellen's visibility is never complete. The public conversation about her did not pause because she had stepped back from it. The narrative that had crystallized around the workplace allegations continued to move without her participation, interpreted and reinterpreted by people who had strong feelings about what it meant and what it said. She became, in the discourse of those years, a kind of Rorschach test. A figure onto whom different audiences projected different convictions about authenticity, accountability, and the distance between public persona and private character. She gave few interviews. When she did speak, it was with the careful restraint of someone who had learned at considerable cost that the media environment she was speaking into was not the same one she had navigated for most of her career. She acknowledged the pain of 2020. She spoke of the difficulty of the transition. She said in one conversation that she had lost friends she had not expected to lose, and that the experience had changed her understanding of what loyalty means and what it costs. What she did not do was perform her grief for public consumption. Could the woman who had built an empire on the daily intimacy of the talk show format, on the carefully calibrated warmth of a host who made millions of viewers feel personally known, chose in her private reckoning a different register entirely. Quieter, more interior, less concerned with how it looked than with what it actually was. Those who remained close to her described a genuine process of reflection. Not the managed, publicist-approved version of reflection that celebrities deploy when crisis management requires the appearance of growth, but the slower, less photogenic kind, the kind that does not resolve neatly or announce itself with a redemption arc. She read, she painted, she spent time in the gardens of the house in Montecito. She existed for perhaps the first time in 2 decades, without a production schedule telling her what the next hour required. And yet the question that hung over all of it, the one that no amount of Montecito quiet could fully dissolve, was the same question she had faced in 1998, in a different form but with the same essential weight. The industry had moved on. The audience had moved on. The cultural conversation had found other subjects, other controversies, other figures to celebrate and interrogate. Ellen DeGeneres, who had once been the most watched woman in daytime television, had become something more ambiguous. Not forgotten. Not forgiven in the uncomplicated way that fame sometimes permits. Simply suspended. Present in memory but absent from the daily rhythm of a culture that rarely waits for anyone. What came next was not yet written. But the woman who had once rebuilt herself from the ruins of cancellation, who had turned the silence of 3 years into 19 seasons of an institution, that woman understood better than most that the end of one chapter has never, in her experience, meant the end of the story. History does not always honor its architects in the moment of building. It waits, it measures. And then, with the slow, unsentimental patience of time, it delivers its verdict. Ellen DeGeneres changed America. Not metaphorically, not in the soft language of inspiration that fades with the news cycle. Structurally, measurably, permanently. The night she walked up to that airport microphone in 1997 and told the truth about herself, she moved something in the culture that had never been moved before. And it did not move back. Studies conducted in the years that followed documented a measurable shift in public acceptance of gay and lesbian Americans that researchers traced in part to that single broadcast. She did not merely represent change, she caused it. At enormous personal cost, with no guarantee of survival, she caused it. That is the fact that survives the workplace allegations, the collapsed brand, the Montecito retreat, the public ambivalence. Whatever the final accounting of her character reveals, and human beings, as other stories also remind us, are never only one thing. The fact of what she did in 1997 belongs to history and cannot be revised by what came after. She was flawed. She was, by multiple credible accounts, capable of a coldness that contradicted everything her public image promised. She built something extraordinary and allowed a culture to grow inside it that caused real harm to real people. Both of these things are true. They do not cancel each other, they simply coexist, the way all complicated human legacies do, imperfect, unresolved, and more honest for it. What remains in the end is not the brand, and it is the girl from Louisiana who stepped onto a small stage with nothing but a sharp eye and a lifetime of pain she had learned to translate, and refused, through cancellation and silence and collapse, to stop speaking. That refusal is the legacy. Everything else is detail. Subscribe for more untold stories, and remember, the most powerful lives are rarely the cleanest ones.